Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle with the Sleep Coach School, and I'm here today with another Talking Insomnia episode. And today I'm joined by Jacob. Hi, Jacob. Welcome to the podcast today.
Hey, Michelle. Thanks. Happy to be here.
Awesome. So Jacob recently completed our sleep immunity program, and so I'm really looking forward to diving into to his story today. So Jacob, I always love to start these by asking a little bit about your insomnia story, kind of how it started and what it looked like for you.
Sure. I feel like I always had a bit of a propensity to have sleepless nights, like even when I was a teenager. But I could always sort of attach it to something that seemed like an obvious cause. So, for example, maybe like when I was a teenager, maybe I'd sleep until noon all weekend, like teenagers do sometimes. And then it's Sunday night and you're getting ready and you're like, oh, I'm not tired. So why can't I fall asleep? Oh, well, it's obvious, my internal clock is just not prepared to wake up at 7 and go to sleep at a reasonable time, right? So stuff like that. But then there would be times where um, maybe I'd be worried about something, or I could just recognize that I had anxiety about something else that was keeping me up. But there was a regular pattern of that manifesting in like the occasional sleepless night, or maybe like a couple um, sleepless nights back to back. But it wasn't really, I'd say there's like acute episodes of insomnia, but nothing that was chronic. Um, and then there was an event in 2016 where, from my perspective at the time, I had this really intense episode of insomnia that seemed out of nowhere.
Okay.
Looking back, I realize it's not quite as out of nowhere as I felt at the time, but I could no longer really attach a cause to it, which I think is where a lot of people's spiral begins, because then you're you're not just dealing with the effects of insomnia. Now you're on the hunt to figure out why it's happening and how to stop it, right? And so now you're involved in like a mystery. And the way that developed at that time was, I had a couple nights where I didn't sleep at all, and I couldn't really figure out why. Um, and then I started engaging in all of the uh, sleep efforts that people go through to like try to figure it out. So melatonin and GABA and like valerian root and on and on. There's so much more than that. Magnesium. Like if there's a supplement out there that is for sleep, whatever it was at the time, I had purchased it and had tried it, and nothing worked, right? And so, of course, when nothing works, that exacerbates the issue, because now you are freaking out that none of your sleep efforts are working. There must be something wrong with me. Um, I'm broken in some way. I forgot how to sleep. And then I resorted to Dr. Google, to try to like figure that out, which of course makes it even worse. And so I was convinced I had like fatal insomnia or something, because it was the only thing that could possibly explain why I had suddenly went from, regularly getting enough sleep to like, 1 to 2 hours a night for weeks on end. Um, and so uh, I hadn't heard of Daniel or anything related to his approach to sleep at that time. Um, this whole episode, I mean, there were other things going on in my life. Like I was engaged in therapy for like other things, like if I look back at things going on in my life, I can be like, oh, there were stressors and other issues with my anxiety that were manifesting in other places that I just couldn't really see, at the time, of why I'd be so hyper aroused, right? But now I look back and I'm like, okay, this made total sense.
Yeah.
Why I was why I was in a state of hyper arousal. Um, but I didn't even have the concept of hyper arousal at the time, like as it
Right.
relates to sleep at least. So I would have never made that conceptual connection. So um, I was doing other things to start to take care of myself in different ways. And that kind of just left on its own, right? Like the the episodes passed, they would reoccur a
Okay.
lot, like over the course of like a couple of years, but it was either really intense or nothing. So it was like I ended up in this pattern where it's like I'd go through like a really difficult month-long stretch, or three weeks to a month-long stretch, and then suddenly I'd have a night where I slept, or I'd chain a couple of nights together where I slept really well, and then it was like okay, and then I'd have like a reprieve
Mm-hmm.
period
Yeah.
before it would start up again. So I was in that cycle for a little while, and then even that started to like wind down, right? And I ended up being feeling like I was in a better place, um, and then I would have it would go back to just like the occasional night
Right.
of sleeplessness that I could tolerate, um, and but then that changed last year around like April or May. And I again had one of those like periods where it's like I can't really connect why this is happening to me. Like why can't I sleep at all? And it was really intense. And oh, and I should mention that I tried. One of the things that made me kind of spiral out in that episode in 2016 was I literally tried sleeping medication,
Yeah.
which didn't work. And then
Right.
it was like, well,
Yep.
this was supposed to be the way that I'm gonna like break down the door into sleep, right? It's like
Yes,
a
last
blunt force
resort.
instrument.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm gonna force my way in, and it didn't work. So, that right. So I had this, I mentioned that because it's important for the next part of the story where I already had in my mind that like sleeping pills just don't work for me.
Mhm.
Like medication doesn't work for me. So like whatever emerges, I can't deal with it using those methods, or at least maybe not the same prescription that I had before. It would have to be something else, or whatever. So anyway, I had this really intense period, and it was really difficult. And one of the things that was difficult about it is, I had this like meditation practice that was not related to sleep at all. It's just something that I did for myself as part of my own spiritual practice. But I had noticed, just in the course of doing that for years, that often it would like reduce my levels of hyperarousal, like in
Mhm.
general, right? Like over time. Um, and I would notice that, if I just happened to do it before bed, I would actually recognize my own like sleepiness, and it wasn't the intention of the meditation. But it is just something I noticed
Mhm.
would happen. But now, when I'm in this cycle, um, I'm now looking for the meditation to be the thing that can help me find
Yeah.
sleepiness again. And when that wasn't working, I was like, "What the heck is wrong right now?" Uh, and so then this practice that had been so like important to my sense of well-being had kind of been inverted, and now I felt like it was actually contributing to my suffering.
Right.
And so it
Right.
had like insomnia had like robbed me of something that had been a part of my well-being practice,
Yeah.
right?
I had the
And
same experience with meditation, the exact same experience with that very.
yeah,
Yeah.
and it was so painful because that's where I really entered a stage of like really, really intense anxiety and despair, right? Because it was like all the tools that I thought were
Mm.
available to me to deal with this, not only are they ineffective, but they seem to be contributing to the problem in some way, but I couldn't figure out how. So I fell back into the pattern of spiraling thoughts and just assuming that my body had forgotten how to sleep. There was something wrong with me. My life is over. All the things that we who have gone through these really intense episodes pass through, where it's just like the end. It's like
Mhm.
life over. And so um, I went through that, and then You know, I had a few, there were some experiences I had even before finding Daniel's channel that kind of put my whole perspective in doubt, as far as like the level of despair that I was reaching. A few moments that were like suggested to me that I was missing something, like missing something very important. And we can circle back and touch on those maybe as we get into a deeper conversation. But what it was just very serendipitous, I think, that as I was sort of realizing that there's something I'm missing here, I can't really put my finger on it, that I found Daniel's channel and I started like reading his methodology for how, you know, to approach this
Right.
this type of thought problem, which I think extends beyond insomnia, but just like there's a form that this problem takes that is just very, it is experienced as very particular, but if you look deeper,
Yes.
it's actually just a really noticeable version of something that is happening
Hmm.
a lot, right?
Yes.
And like in within experience that we don't consciously recognize, but it's actually the same thing happening. But anyway, I as soon as I read um, that, I like knew immediately. Like when he started talking about the gas brake model, and then also how sleep efforts are the very thing causing the hyperarousal, it was like I didn't need to hear, I didn't even need to hear other evidence. My own subjective experience validated it
Yes.
immediately. It was just like, oh, obviously, right? Like it was just such an obvious truth to the whole thing that I immediately was like, I am not doing anything anymore. Like I'm not going to employ efforts consciously to try to sleep better.
Hmm.
And immediately I slept again, right? So it was like, to me, that was like that's all the proof I needed, right? Like, so after months of sort of struggling, and now I'm immediately, it wasn't like so immediate that like that night I slept, but it was just like a clear, gradual on ramp to sleep again that I could just recognize the hyperarousal just like dropping night to night to night to night
Yeah.
to night, right? And so, but it happened really quick, like over the course of like 3 or 4 nights, not
Right.
weeks or months. So I felt very fortunate because I had already now been engaged with people in the community who had been, you know, conditioned through their insomnia for like years, you know, sometimes decades. And I was like, oh well, I'm glad I got out, you know, and like I'm better now. I can, you know, ignore anything related to sleep. But of course, over the summer months, I realized that there's, you know, um, there are other steps that happen after that, right? There's like this, there's immediate conscious recognition of um, of what hasn't been working and what seems to work instead. Um, and so I could take some steps to not consciously make sleep efforts, right? Like I'm no longer going to the store looking for a supplement, or I'm not trying to use my meditation practice consciously to you know, improve my sleep. But instead, it was more seeing what are all the unconscious things I'm doing now to make sleep efforts. And that's, I think that's where the rubber kind of hits the road, because, you know, now you're starting to deal in territory where it's not even so much about choice anymore. It's about just seeing what's happening and how do I relate to what I see happening, regardless of how uncomfortable
Hmm.
it's making me. And so that's sort of where things really tied back into just my own like spiritual practice and spiritual journey writ large. And I kind of I see insomnia now as a um, I hesitate to say gift, but it kind of is.
Yeah.
If I'm in the throes of it, it does not feel that way.
I know.
But when I look at it, I'm like, really, the insomnia was an invitation to
Mm.
really interrogate and look closely at where I wasn't sincere about my own spiritual practice, right? In a completely innocent way, in a non-judgmental way, to say, you know, in the spiritual circles I play in, you know, there's always this concept of like surrender, right? Like surrender to your experience, like surrender to the now, like surrender to what is. And that all sounds so nice and pleasant if we could all surrender, you
Oh,
know,
it
and feel
does.
completely at peace.
Mhm.
But when you look, it's for me, at least in my experience, surrender isn't actually a choice. It's
Mhm.
it's the only choice that I feel like I really have is to see all of the things that are surfacing within consciousness that are not surrendered. So it's really just a matter, and that's where I think the difficulty is for myself and for a lot of people who reach that stage where I get the program, I bought into it, I know on some level that everything that is being said within the methodology is true, but why isn't it working for me?
Mhm.
And on some level, for me at least, it's always because I'm actually still trying to do something about it, right?
That's interesting.
Completely innocently,
Mhm.
right? Like it's not something you can just turn off, but it's just seeing that I'm making an effort. I'm making an effort to do something about this. I wish I wasn't, right? But it's happening. And how do I relate to seeing that, right? And that's sort of where it's simple, but can feel very complicated experientially.
Absolutely. And when you were saying, you know, you don't feel, and in your experience, that we can consciously choose to surrender, do you think we can make conscious decisions to move us closer to feeling a state of surrender? Like, do you think we can reach for that?
I think so. I think this is where it's like it gets really where it's hard to express sort of for me in words the difference, because I think you can look at two people who are doing all the same things externally,
Yes,
but
yes,
their subjective
yes.
experience is completely different. And
Mhm.
that's the subjective experience is really like that's where the rubber hits the road, and you can never really know, right? And I think that's why it's difficult. I mean, it must be difficult to like coach people sometimes, because it's hard to it's hard to point people towards just seeing something slightly differently than the way they're seeing it in
Mhm.
the moment. At least for me, just by saying words, you know. And so, what I would say, I mean, I'll give you an example. I think of where, um, so like positive self-talk, right? Like
Right.
employing a compassionate disposition towards your own suffering and whatever experience you might be having that makes you think that somehow I'm to blame for it, right? Like, I think that is a way that one can really turn towards and put themselves in a position uh, to surrender. I think the other thing is that, um, like, I wouldn't call myself religious. Like, have, I'm not attached to like religious beliefs, but I would use a word like grace
Yeah.
in this context, because grace is something that is not um, chosen and you don't earn. It just happens. And so I think that it is, I think what I've experienced is that the most that I can do is to put myself in a grace prone position.
Mhm.
And I can do things that make it more likely that a grace event will happen to me.
Mhm.
And so um, that's not very clinical. That's not very scientific, and it sounds like it's very woo woo and out there, but it actually is the only word that I can use to describe a subjective experience that I've had going through this. And so if I had a better word for it that might be more appealing to a secular mind, I'd use it. But I actually don't. And so it's what I'm stuck with. But it doesn't require any particular belief. It's just the only word that really describes the experience of surrender that I've felt.
Yeah. I agree. I agree that we can't force it. We can't even necessarily choose it in the moment, you know, because it feels a bit like forcing it sometimes, but that we can choose to put ourselves in situations or in front of teachings or practicing certain things like the empathy, self-kindness, positive self-talk, even practices like meditation and so on, to put us in a position that might lead us there. And for me, when you were speaking of this, it was making me think of the experience of so many students who go through the program, and they're at this stage at the beginning of really learning and understanding, but on that intellectual level. And they're not feeling necessarily a lot of acceptance and surrender, even though they know it's a concept that would be helpful, but they're not feeling it or necessarily connecting emotionally and or internalizing that, if that makes sense. And then at some point, a lot of people will describe this experience of things just kind of, they call it clicking, right? Like things just suddenly clicked. And suddenly the teachings have gone from just an intellectual level to being more internalized. And I'm curious, what did you have a moment like that where you felt like, oh, things clicked? And so if you had that moment, do you feel like it was quite literally a moment for you, or that it was really a culmination of all these things building to give you the opportunity for that to happen?
I think it's both.
Mm,
I can definitely point to moments, right, that felt very significant. Um, uh, but there's almost a double-edged sword to that, right? Because um, a sudden insight, like it clicked,
mhm.
is very significant in that moment, but it actually can be less significant or actually detrimental later if you cling too tightly to it. So I'll give you an example. Um, you know, I had this experience even before I found Daniel's program where, I was just completely in despair. Like I called out of work. It's like a Wednesday. It had felt, I think I'd probably only been sleeping 1 or 2 nights a week, 1 to 2 hours a week for like a week or so. But I just felt so drained because of all of the anxiety that I was piling on it. Like my whole life became around like chasing sleep.
Oh yeah.
And I had felt like I had been up for like a year. Like it felt
Mm.
like time had like crawled to a slow like crawl, and then my whole day was just waiting for the next attempt to sleep again.
Oh, I remember those. Yep.
And
Yeah.
and I had this was after I realized that like meditation wasn't helping, nothing I was taking was helping. I had gotten a prescription for a new sleeping medication, and something said don't take it, like just don't even take it no matter how bad you're feeling, like do everything you can first to not take it. So I hadn't, but it was like in the medicine cabinet waiting to be taken, and I was scared to take it because I was like, what if that doesn't work? Then how am I going to feel, And so um it was like an afternoon, and I was just in complete despair about it. And I just realized that there was like no way out. There was no way out. Like I didn't have the ability to surrender. I kept thinking, well, I just want to surrender to this. I wanted to surrender to this, but I couldn't, and like, that's why I have that like deep empathy for people who are in that space who are just like, look, I conceptually know what surrender means, but it's not available. It's
Mhm.
not available. It's not like a choice that I can make right now. Like I wish I could. I do anything to feel better, but it's just not happening. And it was just sort of like seeing that like there was actually no way that I was going to like extricate myself in that moment and feel better. But in that moment of complete defeat, I felt something else that said, you're okay. Like you're actually okay. You're not going to make yourself okay. Like you're not okay in the sense that this doesn't hurt and you're not suffering right now, but some other part of me that felt a bit more fundamental was actually okay in that moment. And I lied on the bed, and I didn't take a nap, and I didn't sleep, but I just like listened to the birds outside the window, and I felt completely at peace for just a few hours, right?
Mhm.
And I mentioned that, circling back to the question of like, whether it was a single moment or, a compounding of moments, I would say, yeah, that single moment, I look back and I say, that was really significant, right? Because that was a moment where I no longer felt necessarily like there was no hope, right, for relief. Now, the double-edged sword of that is that there were other times between then and various speed bumps where I'd be like, why can't I recapture that? Why can't I recreate that same feeling that I had? And then that becomes its own effort again, right? Like, oh, I just got to get myself to that same level of despair because that's where I was before, and so now I'm trying to control things again. And so, you know, one of the key teachings that really resonates with me is that like those sort of insights are for that moment only. You like enjoy them, you'll let them be wind in your sail to carry you forward, but like don't try to capture the wind. And so that's where that's been a you know, something I have to frequently relearn, right? Is that it's not going to happen the same way every time. And I do believe that there are things that are happening underneath the surface that I'm not always fully like consciously aware of, but are progressively moving things in the right direction. Like there's some loosening of tension that is not always like consciously there, but it's happening and you only see it in hindsight. You're like, oh,
yes,
you know, it just seems like I'm not as attached to the outcomes of going to bed as I used to be, or like, oh, you know, like I'm sleeping well again, you know, or maybe it was gradual, but I'm not obsessing about it as much, you know. And so that was definitely gradual, and I would say equally as significant as like any particular moment of profound insight.
absolutely. This slow and gradual letting go of certain things mentally that probably felt more unconscious than anything else.
Yeah, I'd say so. And you know, to even put it more grounded in something that's more present is, you know, I've been sleeping really well for you know, months now, and then last night, of course, right before I have this call with you, I woke up at like 4 a.m. and or I don't know because I'm in a timeless sleep window, so I actually don't know. That was just a guess.
Of course.
But I just had this like I felt like that hyper aroused feeling that I'm familiar with. I don't know where this is coming from. I don't really know why it's here, but I wasn't falling back asleep, right? And I'm actually glad that happened ahead of this because it reacquainted me with how immediately and innocently my mind will go back to, as a first impulse, to try to find a way out, even in like really subtle ways,
Oh
you
yeah.
know. And just recognizing that like I have to be, it's so important to be kind to yourself when you see that process happening, and to not, again, it's so simple, and it goes back to the same message I've been saying, is that like you're not responsible for the fact that your mind is telling you stories that keep you awake at night.
Yeah. No, exactly. And it's, you know, such habitual pattern and our mind just wanting to prevent suffering and struggle. It's such a well-meaning, I think, process that happens. But I want to go back to when you mentioned that the insomnia felt like an invitation for you, like an invitation to look at maybe other patterns in your life, other issues. What would you say it was an invitation for?
Well, there's actually two kind of times in my life where I felt like there was an invitation through the insomnia. And one was, you know, back in 2016, I really saw it as an invitation. Eventually, I started seeing it as a possible manifestation of just like my own problems with like anxiety and panic disorder.
Yep.
So, you know, I had a panic disorder, which was pretty bad for a couple of years. And I worked on that through, you know, therapy and mindfulness practice and all of that. And I made a lot of progress. So, you know, panic attacks are no longer a problem for me. And disrupted sleep patterns were happening alongside that. So I think there was a relationship, but there was also, I could tell myself a story, right? That
Mhm.
the sleeplessness was related to the panic, and so now I'm getting over
Right.
the panic, and so it's like giving myself permission to reduce hyperarousal around the sleep as well. So that that was an area, right, where I was the invitation might have been, look closely at other areas of your life that could be contributing to this cycle. And I think that's actually still relevant for anyone going through this. Maybe look at other places where your anxiety is surfacing, or surface before your insomnia, to see if there's, if this is a wider problem for you than just focus on sleep. Now, on the other hand, you know, I'm 4 years after anything related to a panic attack. It's no longer really an acute issue for me. I feel generally mostly at ease, in my life, but now I'm going through it again, right? And so now there's no real narrative that's attached to like this other big problem. So in that sense, it was more like, instead of looking at other areas of your life that could be contributing to this, maybe just look at this. Like,
Mhm.
what's happening, what does your mind do generally around this? And at some point, like right when I discovered Daniel's work, it clicked for me that like, oh, like literally everything that I'd been focused on as far as like spiritual practice is actually about this. It's actually about observing what I habitually do. What are my conditioned patterns? And insomnia is just one of those really challenging situations where you can't look away from what's
Yes.
happening at a certain level. And so it was basically, I see it as the universe being like, we're not giving you an escape here.
Mhm.
Like
Mhm.
you're going to have to deal with this. You're going to have to really look at what's happening here. And so, the two completely legitimate pointers, one in 2016, one over the past year, where one was like, hey, maybe look at where anxiety is playing another role in your life, and then another one that's almost the complete opposite, which is like, what, maybe just look at how your mind works in
Mm.
general.
Yep.
And so yeah, that's how I would answer that.
Yeah. Oh, that really resonates with me. I feel the same way for me. I was feeling as though I never thought of it as an invitation. I love that terminology. And for me, it was, I think, an invitation to look at the broader anxiety that I had in my life, that I had in my thought patterns as well, and also a way of approaching life. I think in general with fear. Um,
Right.
as a pattern, is a very deeply ingrained habitual pattern. And so it really kind of was shining a light on all of these types of things. And I like what you said, it was also an invitation to look at how your mind worked in general, all of it. And I think that's so true. And I know that can sound like a lot, like intimidating to hear that. But it goes back to this idea that for so many people, including myself, the insomnia journey, once you were out on the other side, you can look back and feel like it was a journey of self-discovery. And you certainly don't feel like that when you're in it. So I can understand there's people listening to this right now thinking that is ridiculous. But did you have that feeling as well? Or do you have that now, that it was a self-discovery experience essentially?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it was more, I mean, for me, it's a lot of discovering what I'm not. I think that there are moments where it became clear that, uh, well, in the moments where I felt relief from whatever thought patterns were coming up or whatever cycles, where I felt okay with that playing out was an internal recognition that I'm not that. Like, I'm not that process playing out.
Yeah.
And as soon as I'm no longer identified with it, tension around it reduces. The the real suffering for me was the sense of high stakes. Like, there are so many high stakes
Mm-hmm.
to these thought patterns playing out in real time. I'm gonna die. I'm gonna like my whole life is going to be over, and I'm never going to recover.
Mm-hmm.
What was allowed to show itself um, through the process was that there's actually a sense in which those things can play out. Those negative thought patterns and thought loops can play out. But what I really am is untouched by them playing out. And I'm just caught in an ignorant. I'm caught in the ignorance of believing on some level, often a very unconscious level, that I am my thoughts. I am those thoughts. My identity is tied to those thoughts in some way that feels like the stakes are so high. The stakes are so high that I, you know, get out of that pattern, especially if you have like a family and a job and like responsibilities. Also things that I'm very attached to. I'm identified with like all the roles that I play there. You know, when you're not really given an option to look away from the thought patterns, at least for me, there's at least an opportunity to recognize that all of these thought patterns are happening within something, and that something people call, like awareness or whatever. But I mean, that's the common pointer, is that awareness itself isn't actually in that loop, right? It's the container in which that loop is happening within.
Mm-hmm.
And the more you can kind of observe it happening, I feel like over time, the less you may feel like it is your identity. Your identity
Yeah.
are those thoughts. And so at least that's how it plays out for me in my life.
And was there anything in particular that helped you start to disidentify from all the negative thoughts that you were happening? How did you start to step away and really, really drop into that observer role with yourself more and more throughout this process?
I think one thing that really benefited me is that I was already on like a spiritual path beforehand. And so I'd already begun the process through other means, even like psychotherapy and things like that, where you start to like step back a little bit and assess things through a more objective lens. And that I don't mean to say objective lens to suggest that you're indifferent, because I think that's a mistake too, to try to like divorce your like create a feeling of try to create a feeling of indifference to what's going on. I find that can be its own trap. But more to just like I was already starting to consciously recognize that, very simply, I could observe my thoughts, right? And if you can observe your thoughts, then you're not your thoughts, right? Like that's just, it's very basic, right? Like I feel like anyone can right now in this very moment, just be like, oh, well, okay, I'm recognizing a thought.
Mm-hmm.
What's recognizing the thought? Okay, I don't really know, but whatever it is kind of feels more fundamental, right? And so I was already doing that, but what Insomnia really did was to say to me, look harder. Like you can't distract yourself from this. I think there's a lot of areas in my life that I'm just running on autopilot, like many of us do. And this was saying, okay, this is how you run on autopilot when faced with something that is so painful and feels so uncomfortable that you're not going to be able to distract yourself by necessarily like going out for a drink or playing a video game or whatever. It's like it becomes too acute and too demanding of your attention that you're gonna have to look at it in some way. And so then in some ways it sort of like closed all the doors for the other options and tactics I would use to avoid my life, right? And what I saw through that is that, well, the only thing I have left, because it's just too in my face, is I sort of have the ability to change how I'm relating to it.
Mm-hmm.
in each and every moment, but it's really each and every moment. You know, each and every moment, I have a choice to say, okay, I'm seeing this. It sucks. It feels really bad, but I have a choice to relate to it through a sense of like open-heartedness and willingness to receive whatever is happening to whatever extent I'm capable, or I can retreat from it by forming more thoughts, you know, or you know, and so that's really what it came down to, and it's something that was literally a moment to moment decision, you know, and so I think that's where I made the most progress, if you will, was just having to mindfully just address what was happening moment to moment often, because there was no, it didn't really feel like there was another choice, or it just became very obvious that any other approach felt so much worse.
Yes. No, I completely understand. And that concept of having a wholehearted, open approach to what is fundamentally suffering can be hard. But then when we practice that, the irony is there's less suffering. So on the front end of
Right.
that, it sounds impossible. But and I like how you had mentioned, you know, it's a moment to moment decision. And I like that piece because we also get to decide how we're relating to what's happening. Because I think a lot of the time we don't feel like we have any control. We feel very helpless. And so did you go through a period of this like helplessness around this? Or did you always have a sense of that you had some agency, you had some ability to make some decision in terms of how you were choosing to relate to what's happening? Or how was that process for you?
Yeah, and this is where words get kind of tricky, because it's like there's a sense in which helplessness is like a really core truth of the human condition, and then there's a sense where you can use that as an excuse to like
Mhm.
not do anything.
Yes,
And so
yes.
I don't, so like, I want to like try to walk that fine line, because I actually think that like hopelessness was more useful to me than hope at a lot of stages of this.
Interesting.
Um, uh, in the sense that like um, hope hope is what you use every time you make a sleep effort, right? Like every time you make a sleep
Oh,
effort, you're hoping, you're
that
really hoping that this is going to be the thing, right? And so there is a sense in that you come to the recognition that that's actually hopeless. It's a hopeless set of endeavors, right? And and I think that's true in a nuanced way to in a lot of areas when it comes to like dealing with insomnia. It's like realizing what is a hopeless action,
yeah.
um, and um, and it can get pretty deep, right? Like when it's hopeless to try to control my thoughts, right? But it's also hopeless to try to stop myself from trying to control my thoughts, right? Like it's kind of just recognizing that, and then also allowing for the possibility that you can see that, and some sense of emergent well-being can gradually or suddenly come from that recognition.
Mhm.
And that sounds like hope, right? So now
Yes,
we're back,
yes,
again. And
yes.
so that's how I would put it. The words are very tricky here, but um, the other thing that I would say that really helped me and seems um, just so important is one thing that I saw by being more moment to moment in myself, and then also making intentional efforts to this end as well, is like I started to realize that genuine moments of happiness and joy were were possible, no
Mm,
matter how
yes, yes.
little sleep I received. Uh, that doesn't mean that it doesn't suck in general. I think we all would admit, you know, even if we've been through this journey or have the right, you know, orientation towards sleeplessness and wakefulness, that like we'd all prefer to be well rested than not, right? And yet I started to realize that there were like moments that would organically just come up, unforced moments throughout the day where I was like, oh, I feel okay. Or like that made me laugh. Or like my kid did something that I really felt like I connected with him there. Or, you know, a moment with my partner where it just felt really good.
Mhm.
And it was like, okay, well, just seeing that that's possible, like in a state of from a state of suffering, from a less than ideal and unsatisfactory state, is liberating in some sense, because then it reduces for me the stakes, right? The
Yeah.
stakes no longer seem as high, that once once I begin recognizing that joy is possible, it's not contingent on the amount that I slept the night before. And I think that even once you start to recognize that more and more, I think there's something that happens in the brain that even unconsciously the brain like calms down a little bit
Yes.
gradually. And so I think that that is why it's really important, and maybe even important for some, to like seek out moments of joy, uh, especially in the throes. And I know for some people that might look like just not changing anything or like trying to meet all of their world commitments, but I really think it comes down to individuals. You know, like there are definitely times where the act of me not missing a workout or like meeting my commitments was a good thing, and because my relationship to those actions seemed not related to a sleep effort or something. And there were times where the exact same thing did, right? Like just like meditation, there were times where I was like, I got to work out because it's going to make me more tired, or I have to work out because if I don't, then I'm going to feel like a failure, or I'm going to feel like my life's falling apart. And then there were times where I do the exact same thing, but it was really like, you know what? I feel like I want to do this so I feel better like right now, you know? And so that it's so difficult to just look at what's happening externally and what someone's actually doing
Mhm.
and make a definitive judgment call of like, that's the right thing and that's the wrong thing. It really comes down to just how I felt about what I was doing, or you know, what was the real motivation behind any action that I was taking. There's no binary like correct action, wrong action. It's really individual and comes down to like your own subjective truth about what I'm actually doing, and the willingness for me to be honest with myself.
Mhm.
Why am I actually doing this right now? You know, because there were times where I don't think I was that honest with myself. I would tell myself, "Oh, I'm kneeling down to meditate right now because you know, I'm trying to connect with my inner self or whatever." But really, I wasn't. Really, I was just like, "Please make me sleep," you know, on some level. Um, and that's part of the process too. I think is just, I mean, for me, it was like learning how to be more honest with myself in general, you know, and realizing there's a cost, there's a price to not being honest.
Mm.
And I think in some ways that's where insomnia can come from, is like there's areas in my own relationship with myself where I'm not being like completely honest
Mm.
about like, why am I doing something, like how attached am I to certain outcomes, like all of those things. And for me, insomnia was just like a flashlight on all of the places where, you know, that, you know, that's just pretense, you know, like you think you're all, you know, serene and peaceful, but no, like I'll just push on this little lever here and you're a mess, you know. And so just realizing just like how fragile, you know, my own life really could feel with just a little piece missing, like no sleep.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why, there is no set, series of actions that people can take to really resolve insomnia, because, you know, it's really about connecting with ourselves. And so we want to work with people and provide, the concepts and the tools to help people, I think, really connect with themselves on this, and to let go of certain things and to understand themselves better. Because I do think that we all fall into that trap, the moment we're dealing with any sort of health issue or challenges, we start to really reach externally a lot for any sort of external solution, and we don't tend to look inwards. And that is so often where we're going to find the answers and the guidance and everything. And so um, I really resonate with what you're saying, and the idea that it shines a flashlight. And really, we have to look inwards during this process. We have to connect with ourselves, and as opposed to just, let's say, going through some rote actions and hoping that it will be helpful. So it's really about connection, which is why this whole journey is self-discovery, which is something that we tend to only be able to see in hindsight. And that's why in a lot of these success stories, we hear people talking about the silver lining of the experience or the gifts of the experience. And I know if I had heard that in the midst of my insomnia, it would have probably made me angry.
Yeah.
Or I would have thought it was dishonest. But now that I'm on the other side, I can completely see that, and I see my own silver linings, and I completely have an appreciation for the entire experience and where I am now because of it. So yeah, I completely understand. So I'm curious, now that you've gone through it all, now that you're really on the other side and you've gone through all of it, what would you say to yourself if you could go back to the version of you that was in the worst part of your insomnia? Like, what would you say to that version of yourself, knowing what you know now?
Trust your own life.
Oh, I love that. Interesting. And then,
Yeah, I mean, like, you're wiser than you think you are. But
mhm,
the wisdom isn't coming from any smart thought you might have about what you're going through. Your body knows what to do. Your
mhm,
body has a wisdom in it, and
mhm,
there's a wisdom that transcends body and mind. And you know it's difficult, but there's a sense that what's happening is happening for you, and not to you.
mhm. I completely agree. I know that's a hard concept sometimes, but very, very true in so many cases, and easier to see once we've moved at a certain point along this. And I have one more question for you, and that is, given that you've gone through all of this yourself and you've also worked with us in the sleep immunity program, is there any guidance you could give to some of the students that maybe they're just starting their journey with all of this, or maybe they've been at it for a couple months and they're struggling? Is there any message that you can leave with them?
Yeah, I would say it's really helpful to draw inspiration, right, from people who have kind of gone through a very similar journey. Um, but it's also easy, from my experience, to think that my insomnia is the most unique and special form of insomnia, or there's some character defect or flaw or physical problem with me that is like so unique that whatever happened to another person just doesn't apply to me. Like,
Mhm.
I think there's like this trap of specialness that I fell into over and over again, to the point where I think I have um, like fatal insomnia, because of course I would be the special person, the one in like 300 trillion chance
Of course.
to get it, because I'm special. Like,
Yes,
something that horrible would happen to me personally because I'm special enough to hit that lottery.
of course it would.
Like, it's very easy to be really harsh on yourself in that way, and to think that you are and what it comes down to is, I think, for some people, and especially me, is that there's something about you that's unworthy
Mm.
of finding peace.
Oh, yeah.
And I think I would just say, just like, keep an eye on that. And if you see it come up, like, recognize it for what it is, which will probably be in the form of a thought, and just see that that's all it is. That thought, that there's something unique about you that's going to prevent you from finding inner peace, is it's just another thought in a long stream of thoughts that you're probably having about the story of your insomnia. And so I would just say, you're not a story. You're not just a collection of thoughts. And, to, I guess, take heart in what other people have gone through, and just, in that sense, I think hope is a good thing. And just realizing that, you're not alone, right? Like, other people have gone through this journey and come out the other side, and there's actually no reason you can't too.
Absolutely. That's a powerful message. And it can be so hard when we're in it. And I think that's a really great message of hope for everyone. And I think almost all of us, when we're in it, do believe that we're unique and we have a very special, extreme version of insomnia that is somehow untouchable. But as we all discover, it's just not true. So it's really helpful to hear that. And Jacob, I want to thank you so much for being here today and for sharing your story with us. It's a really powerful, really interesting conversation. I know I enjoyed it so much. So thank you again. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Awesome. Okay. Well, until next time, everyone, have a good one. Bye, everyone.
You too.